Finally, here I want to talk about Chile and its experience during this era of military dictatorships. And the case of Chile is probably the most well-known and studied of the military dictatorships in Latin America. And we haven't talked a lot about Chile in this course, but of course you can use the Chile Reader to write your final paper. And Chile is a country that has a relatively stable political system historically. It has a history of very competitive elections where many parties partake in the electoral process, including the Communist Party, which participated in elections in the mid-20th century. Electoral participation has often hovered around 80% of registered voters. And the country's economy has historically been dominated by mineral exports, and particularly copper. Copper has been Chile's bread and butter. And American corporations in the mid-20th century dominated Chile's copper industry. And Chile's unique in the fact that its road to socialism is not going to be through armed force, but rather through elections. And it was Salvador Allende, who you see pictured here on the slide, who would assume power in 1970. And Allende, he was a medical doctor. He was a Marxist, and he was a member of the Chilean Socialist Party. And he advocated a peaceful road to socialism through elections. And he ascribed Chile's underdevelopment to the upper classes' alliance with U.S. private investors. And he used anti-capitalistic rhetoric to describe this relationship. And he blamed Chile's poverty on the fact that the country was capitalistic and dominated by foreign economic interest. And in 1970, indeed, U.S. corporations had more than $1 billion of investment in Chile. And most of it, of course, was in the mining industry. And Allende had been running for president ever since the late 1950s. In 1958, Allende, when he ran for president, he won nearly 30% of the vote. And that really awakened U.S. policymakers to Allende and what was going on in Chile, because he only lost the presidency that year by 3 points. And so in the early 60s, the United States starts mobilizing against Allende to make sure that he doesn't win the presidential election in 1964. But in 64, he wins nearly 40% of the vote. And the United States was spending about $4 million on anti-Allende propaganda during these years. And the idea was just to scare Chileans, scare them about communism and to equate Allende with communism. Then, in 1970, in the next presidential election, Allende won the presidency with only about 36% of the vote. And this angered Richard Nixon, who was the president during this period. He famously heard about the news about Allende winning the presidency and banged his fist on the table where he was at, screaming, that SOB, that SOB. And Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of the State Department during these years, famously said, quote, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people," end quote. And Nixon and Kissinger, they were concerned about geopolitics and the ripple effect and how Chile could become an example to other Latin American countries who were seeking to overthrow capitalism and install a socialist regime. Nixon didn't want to look weak on communism. So as soon as Allende assumed the presidency in 1970, the CIA started to mobilize the anti-Allende media in Chile. And the CIA also funded strikes and lockouts and other actions designed to destabilize Allende's government. And in the meantime, Allende was carrying out rapid economic reforms. So he nationalized the foreign-owned copper industry, land reform was promoted, price controls were instituted, and this had the effect of destabilizing the Chilean economy. So there was hyperinflation, a lot of tensions were building up, polarization increased because the middle class and the elites were scared that Chile was now going to turn to communism. And indeed, Fidel Castro had visited Chile in 1971, and this scared the daylights out of conservatives and elites in Chile. It was in this atmosphere that the Chilean military decided it was going to intervene and overthrow Salvador Allende. And it did so with the support of the United States. And the coup began on September 11th, 1973. Very easy date to remember. At noon that day, the Air Force attacked the presidential palace, and that's the image you see occurring here on the left. And then troops began to storm the palace. And of course, they were looking for Allende, who was inside the palace during the bombing. But Allende, rather than being taken prisoner by the military, he instead committed suicide on September 11th. And from there, the repression was very rapid and brutal. Within a few days, 2,000 people were killed. Labor leaders, peasant leaders, Marxists, anybody who had been prominent supporters of the regime were rounded up. And actually, my professor who taught me this course about 20 years ago when I was an undergraduate, he was then a graduate student at UCLA, and he had been doing his dissertation research in Chile during the Allende's government. And he was there on September 11th, 1973. And he himself, an American, was picked up by the Chilean army because the Chilean army was just going after all intellectuals because most students and intellectuals supported Allende. And he worked, my professor, he was a young student in his early 20s, and he wore glasses, so he was accused of being a communist sympathizer. And he was rounded up by the Chilean army, and he was tortured for several days before he was released and allowed to return to the United States. So it wasn't just Chileans that were being persecuted, but even in this case, one American that I know about, again, my professor who had taught me this course. And after the coup, Congress was dissolved, the Constitution was suspended, and Augusto Pinochet took power. The case of the military dictatorship in Chile was a little bit different from the neighboring countries such as Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. In Chile, it was just one individual who would rule the country for 17 years until 1990. So whereas in Argentina and Brazil, you had military officers who rotated in the presidency, in Chile, it was just one general, Pinochet. Nonetheless, his regime was similar to the others in the fact that it was very brutal and repressive and committed lots of human rights abuses. Thousands of people were killed, some 80,000 people were jailed, 40,000 were tortured during Pinochet's rule as the dictator of the country. Political parties were banned, particularly the leftist political parties. Later, more conservative political parties would be allowed to operate. And the government's violence was not only directed at dissidents, but also against their families as well. And the United States, rhetorically and openly, it criticized these human rights abuses, but it still provided material support to Pinochet and to his government. And the United States and the CIA also helped Pinochet to hunt down his enemies in neighboring countries. And there was a coordination. They were coordinating their intelligence gathering between all these countries so that they could jail and repress their dissidents abroad. And the dictatorship goes on through the 70s and through the 80s. In 1988, there was a referendum on whether to return Chile back to democracy, and 56% of the Chileans voted not to allow Pinochet to remain in power, while 44% favored him remaining in power. And so after that, there was some constitutional reforms that took place, and then by the early 1990s, Chile had returned to democracy, and Pinochet had stepped down. And of course, in all these countries, there was the issue about what do we do about these individuals who have committed human rights abuses, because as we'll talk about in a few weeks, Latin America transitions towards democracy by the 1990s, and people who had committed these human rights abuses needed to be punished. And it was really kind of a painful episode in these countries' history because it opened up a lot of wounds from the past. And Pinochet was eventually indicted on human rights abuses, But he died in 2006, having never been convicted of any case. And in fact, in all these countries during the military dictatorships, very few people were actually punished for the crimes they committed. Only in Argentina, where there's some junior officers that were committed of crimes and they were jailed. But in general, most of these generals and military officers who committed these human rights abuses, they were never really punished, only in a few specific cases.